Welcome to week 2 of module 1. Today we're going to demonstrate a conversation of what you might be thinking about when you go through your resource evaluation assignment. So I'm Lauren Newton, I'm your instructor for this course.
I'm Kat Silvers, I'm going to be the teaching assistant for this course.
And we're going to assume that you've watched, or at this point you need to go ahead and watch the video that goes before this. So make sure to watch Cat Library, A Perfect Solution to Stress. Welcome back. We're going to talk about 5 different elements that you want to evaluate this resource by. So with those 5 different elements, for each one, you want to assign it a number. So 1 to 5, with 1 being the least helpful and 5 being the most helpful. And when we get to the different rankings, depending on what it is, you'll figure that out. So we're going to talk about both the ranking and also then a little bit of a description as to our thought process behind it. And then we'll follow that up after those 5 elements with an overall assessment of the resource. Our first element is authorship. So what did you think about the authorship of this video?
So I think that CBS is the company that is kind of producing this, putting this on, and I think that CBS is generally a pretty reputable resource. I would say that they're pretty good for an author. We don't know exactly who the producer is, although possibly. I mean, we know that the person who's interviewing, is doing a really good job of interviewing the kitten librarian, and she's the person that they're interviewing, and so she is the expert in kitten librarianship, which sounds awesome, by the way. And so she's got all the information. She's the one who runs it, so she knows everything there is to know about it. And so since she's being interviewed, she is definitely reputable. And the anchor is a great anchor. I mean, all of the people who are involved are really reputable, but then it's also not like a scholarly resource either. Like you're not getting like an academic journal from it. So I would probably say it's a pretty good resource. I would say authorship is a 4 out of 5, not 100%, but pretty far up there.
Okay. I would agree. I would agree with that thought process, especially with the rank. I think a 4 is good. For me, I probably would take a little different take of I would look at I would look at the byline. And so there is a byline on there and it says Steve Hartman, and I can look up, apparently he is a producer for CBS, and so I can look up his body of work. I can look and see whether or not he's, if this is his very first news segment that he's ever done, or maybe is there something else about it too. So if he's done others, if he's seasoned, if he has a body of work in a general area, and does he pick good sources, which is what you did. So I do think that I would consider this a 4 as well. A lot of it goes into the weight of the value of credibility of CBS, and also he has a body of work. So good. All right. So element number 2 is relevance. So I would think that this video I'm just going to go out there and I think it's a 3. Maybe even a 2. So I think that the relevance for this one is we need to go back to what the topic is. And the topic was about therapy animals for college students and at times of finals. So I think that this was relevant somewhat because it does talk about animals, and it talks about animals as stress relief. So kittens and helping employees, but this is not for a college campus. It was for a workplace environment. And so I think that while it's interesting, it does talk about therapy animals as stress relievers. It doesn't talk about students. It doesn't talk about colleges. It doesn't talk about libraries really in the sense that we're thinking of a library. So I'm thinking maybe it's a 2. So what do you think?
See, I think also a 2 or a 3 would both be pretty valid for the same reasons. I mean, it does talk about stress relievers. It talks about, how having a kitten at your desk in your workplace will help you with, relieving stress, and especially when you have a million emails, a million things you're doing, that can be very stress relieving and also a slight distraction. But I mean, I agree. It doesn't talk about colleges or students or libraries, but I mean, it does have that stress element. So it might be something that you might put in your paper reference saying, that there is a place that is doing this kind of thing out there and it does relieve stress. Here's an example of it. But I wouldn't use it to drive home any major points. It could be an additional thing, but not necessarily oh yeah, it's great to have animals in libraries for stress relief because of this video. It's not going to be
Yeah.
your big reason, but it will help, get towards that big reason.
Third element is documentation. So what do we think about documentation for this one?
Well, they did use a resource, the kitten librarian. She's very well, versed in this subject. So I would think that they called upon a resource that's going to be pretty, highly valuable and valid. So I would say documentation is actually pretty good for this one.
They also did include, personal testimony too. So they
That's
included
true.
some of the coworkers who actually talked about the benefit of having the kitten and on their stress. And so they used like a primary source in a way also of interviewing and they would say, and I think that they did do a good job of documentation because they told you who this person was and why it matters. And so the main thing with that documentation piece is figuring out, is this someone's personal opinion? Or is it documented? Is it coming from a resource? And so we can definitely trace these are coming from outside people, that they're interviewing people who can or cannot be considered experts depending on what it is. But in this case, so with the documentation rank, we want to both evaluate whether or not we think the sources that were being consulted are of good quality, or at least that they make sense for the resource. But then also we want to find out, did they actually tell you who those sources were? So it's kind of both things.
Yes.
And I think in both of those cases, yes, you're correct. I think that they did a good job. So I would probably say this one in terms of actually documenting was probably a 5. And getting appropriate resources.
Right, and they do tell you who everybody is. They flash at the bottom of the screen. They say, this is the person's name. So, I mean, I think they did a really great job with it. So I would agree with you.
Okay, so our fourth element is currency. So they do have a date of June of 2015 on this one. So we want to evaluate for currency both what the date was and whether or not it matters. So whether or not it matters when it was published. So what do you think about that? Both of those elements.
Well, 2015 is not that long ago. It's last summer. So I would say that just in general, it's pretty recent. So I think it's a pretty good current article or video. And I guess just on that notion, I would still give it, a 4 or 5, probably even a 5, depending on how the resource ties in with what we're working on. So based on our topic, I think that it's pretty current for our topic. I mean, we're talking about colleges and stress relief and libraries and students and how they react to all of it and the effect of it. And, so it's something like that. We probably want something pretty current, maybe from the last, 4 or 5 years tops, because we want some new recent trends. But I would say we don't want to go anything beyond that. We don't want things from like 10 years ago, because things are very different now than before. So in terms of this video, I would say that I'd probably give it a 5. I think it's totally current and recent and relevant.
Okay, I agree. I think it would be a 5 as well. It's very nice that it was only last year, and I do think that that's still relevant. In terms of the, what would I think is too old? I think usually 5 years is probably a pretty good standard, because landscapes change, information changes. The only kind of caveat I would say is that if this were talking about, really foundational concepts, so maybe just talking about like stressors. So maybe if it were something on stressors, you might want to see if there is, if there has been some major research done in the last 5 years, you'd want to make sure that you are staying within that last 5 years. But if really if the concept of stress is not new, if you're just talking about stress relieving, maybe something from 10 years ago might work if it's only talking about the idea of doing stress and assuming there's been no foundational or crazy research, or not crazy, but major research done in the last few years that totally debunks all old research. But in this case, I don't think it's a problem, and I would agree it's a 5.
And I would also say too that if we were working on a topic that was something along the lines of stress relievers through the years, then maybe, you know, we
That's
would
true.
want some things from like 10 or 15 years ago, so that we can
Very true.
and go back even further than that to say, you know, this is kind of the history in our paper. This is the history of what it used to be, and then here's where it is now, where we have kitten librarians and kittens in our offices.
Yes.
I want one.
So our last element is publication type. So what do we think about the publication type? This is a video, which is not your traditional type of research. You know, normally when you're doing a research paper, you're usually looking for an article or a book or maybe a website. So what do you think about the fact that this is a video?
Well, you know, if I'm writing a scholarly paper, the first thing that I'm probably going to want to gravitate towards is peer-reviewed resources. So resources that have been evaluated by other people who are specialists in the field and been given like a green light that this is an awesome paper. So I probably would go to those first, but and maybe some other, you know, books and articles as well. Videos I generally don't typically go to, not to say that they are not useful, because this one is, I think. Even though, you know, we had given those other ratings before, I would probably still want to include a video like this in my paper. Okay. So I would probably, it's not my favorite one. I'd probably give it maybe a 2 or a 3, just because it's not my preferred resource, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't be slightly higher if you wanted to argue that it's really, you know, your preferred resource and here's why, and you had a good logical argument for that. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. It does kind of depend on the assignment. And so, you know, whether or not you're eligible to use videos is a big piece.
That's
so
true.
If your professor says no videos, it must be something where you can, you know, actually take a quote and quote from a specific page number, because you're not going to be able to use an in-text citation that talks about a page number.
In which case the video would be completely invalid, and it would be 0
and
because
it would be 0.
or 1, because 1 is our lowest number on
Yes.
our scale. But
Yes.
you can't even use it, so then, you know, you would
that
put
would
it as
be
a 0. But if you're
However,
allowed to,
yeah, if you're allowed to, and for this assignment or for this class, yes, you would be able to use. Not that you have to do a paper, but if you were a hypothetical paper, I would say that videos can be used. I would probably give this one probably a 3 as well, or something like a 3. I think that video is fine, but the fact that it's a news article, a news video. It is relatively short. I don't know that it's presenting a wealth of knowledge. It's really just mostly useful for that kind of the eyewitness, or, you know, the personal touch of it.
Yes.
I think it's good. But in terms of using for research, if you weren't really, if there were another thing that maybe if you were using a documentary or something that was a little longer, that might be a more valued resource.
I agree.
As a source type. So our last part is we do want to give an overall evaluation for the resource. So we want to think about it in total. Yes, there have been 5 elements. We've been looking at them. We've been ranking them individually by those 5 elements. But we want to talk about, now this is just it's not a number. It's just, would this be useful for that topic? So just a quick sentence or 2 talking about it. And so for that, I would think that I probably would not use this video for this particular topic. I might for background, but for the meat of the article, or the meat of the research that I'm doing, if I'm really focusing on programming for that libraries can do with using therapies as stress release for finals, I go back to that relevance a lot. I really do. So I go back to the relevance. I know we said that it was a kind of a 2 or a 3 for relevant, or a 2, I think we said, for relevance. So I'm probably thinking that it's not going to be my first choice. Now, if I do decide to talk in my article about, or in my research, my paper that I'm doing about the concept of stress, then I might use it.
See, I might actually use it if I were writing it.
Okay.
And so my reason for that is because if I'm talking about stress relieving for students in libraries, on college campuses, I would probably say, students get in the zone and they're studying and they're working on all sorts of things, and they, you get this almost like horse blinders on, like you're engaged in this one thing and you don't pay attention to your own stress levels, you don't pay attention to your body, if you're eating enough, if you're drinking enough water, all that kind of stuff. So this video still applies to that argument. And so I would probably say, it's the same thing in the workplace. when you get working on a project or you're answering, 100 emails all at once, it's the same thing. You get focused in on it, you zone in on it, you focus on it so much that nothing else really matters, and then you forget to eat lunch. So I would say that it's still relevant in that respect, and I would
Okay.
still probably use it in that part of my argument. But like I had mentioned earlier, I definitely would not use it as like a drive home point to sum up my whole paper, because it's
Okay.
just not, it's relevant on a small scale, but not on the bigger scale.
Okay. So we have a difference of opinion.
Mhm.
That's all right. The important thing you know is that while you will be graded on your ranks, you will also be, that's why those descriptions are so important. So you're going to give a 1 to 5 on all those different elements, and you're also going to have like a 1 to 2 sentence description as to why you would use it. Even if your number disagrees with myself and Kat when we're grading your both your assignment and also the larger project that this is setting you up for, that's all right. As long as you clearly describe why you're giving it that rank, then and we buy it in a sense. So if we buy your argument as to why you're giving it that number, the number itself doesn't matter as much if you can convince it. So. But the number is still required. So if you have, if you can come up with the number and you can defend it, that's the most important part of this. So thank you for your time today. I hope this helped, and feel free to look at the rubric for this assignment and make sure to evaluate those 2 additional article resources that are at the bottom of this assignment. Thanks.
See you online.